Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Dario Maestripieri. He is a professor in comparative human development and is also affiliated with the Institute on the Formation of Knowledge at the University of Chicago. His current main interests are evolution of human behavior and its biological regulation, and 20th century European literature. So, Dr. Maestripieri, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, so first of all, because you seem to have very interdisciplinary interests, how would you describe yourself as a scholar, and what do you do in your research?
Yeah, I see myself as an evolutionary and interdisciplinary behavioral scientist. So broadly speaking, I'm interested in all aspects of mind and behavior, both in animals and humans. The evolutionary perspective obviously is important to me, but although my background is in biology, I no longer view myself as a biologist because my interests have led me to cross the boundaries with other disciplines, other behavioral disciplines, and more recently, also, I've crossed the boundaries between sciences and humanities. So some of the things I'm interested in fall within the domain of humanistic disciplines.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, to get into the questions I prepared for today, first of all, do you think that there's something like human nature, and what would that be?
So as members of the Homo sapiens species, human beings have certain genetic, anatomical, physiological, but also psychological and behavioral characteristics that are shared by all members of the species, that are common to all members of the species. Sometimes we call these universals. I have to point out that every time in biology we make generalizations or we say something is universal, we mean it in a probabilistic sense. So everything in biology is probabilistic. Essentially, we're making a statement about the majority of individuals. So there are exceptions, and the occurrence of one exception, for example, to a particular principle or a particular law in biology does not disprove the law. In physics, on the other hand, laws are deterministic. So if you find one exception of a phenomenon that does not obey a particular law of physics, that's a problem for physics. In biology, it's not a problem. So when I say that we have characteristics that are common to all human beings, I don't exclude the possibility that there might be some individuals who don't share these characteristics. To give you an example, all human beings have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, 1 mouth. We're all able to speak, but every now and then, an individual is born maybe without legs or without arms or without the ability to speak. Obviously, that does not make the person not human. So we consider human beings also individuals who lack some of these characteristics. But probabilistically, most human beings have these characteristics. So by human nature, what we mean is all the psychological and behavioral characteristics of human beings that we all share more or less in common. So some of these characteristics are quite general. So for example, our ability to learn and to produce language is a pretty broad characteristic, or our ability to engage in abstract thinking, which is something that presumably animals do not have, but all human beings have. So these are fairly broad characteristics that are part of human nature, but there are also more specific characteristics, which might include, for example, particular propensities or tendencies to behave in certain ways in particular situations or in response to certain environmental stimuli. So for example, when young children are separated from their mothers briefly, they show a distress response. They start crying. That is part of human nature, meaning that human children are predisposed to be in distress most of the time when they're separated from their mothers. when we say that some aspects of our thinking or our behavior reflect human nature, we also imply that these traits are to some extent genetically determined or controlled, and that they presumably evolved by natural selection. So essentially, we're implying that they have an adaptive function. So by human nature, we mean adaptive physiological characteristics, psychological and behavioral characteristics that in the past, and in many cases also in the present, have helped us survive and reproduce.
Mm-hmm. So taking into account what you just said about human universals and the probabilistic nature of human psychology, in this case, I think we could say, how do you explain individual differences in human behavior from an evolutionary perspective?
So the first, before you ask the question of how you explain individual differences, you have to ask the question of whether they can be explained or should be explained. Not all individual differences in psychological functioning or in human behavior can or should be explained from an evolutionary perspective. So some of these differences, yes, are the result of selection, having acted in the past, that represent different ways of being adapted to the environment, different ways of solving problems. But others are simply the product of the environment in which we live, including many novel aspects of this environment that we have only recently been exposed to. And other individual differences are the product of maybe some differences in the functioning of our mechanisms. So sometimes our physiology doesn't work the same way in all individuals. So there are some differences, which can begin as early as the first few months of gestation. So what happens in the first 3 months of gestation is very important, for example, for brain development. And sometimes there are differences in those early stages, which later would translate into stable differences in psychology and behavior. Not all those differences are can be explained from an evolutionary perspective. When we do establish that some individual differences can and should be explained through an evolutionary perspective, so one way we usually do it is to interpret these differences as strategies, individual strategies. So by strategies, we mean alternative but equally effective ways of solving problems. So human beings are confronted with problems, many of which come from the social environment on a daily basis. And in some cases, we all share a common response to these problems. In some cases, different individuals have different ways of dealing with these problems. And these strategies happen to be consistent over time. They represent stable differences. So that's why we call them strategies. So in some cases, assuming that these differences are the product of natural selection having acted in the past, we know that what makes a particular behavior adaptive or not, doesn't depend entirely on the behavior itself, but also it depends on what other individuals are doing. So a behavior can be optimal and adaptive if, for example, it's rare, if no other individual shows the same behavior. For particular phenomena where there is variability in both behavior and its genetic basis, selection acts on behavior in a way that we call frequency dependent. So in other words, there could be a genetic polymorphism for particular genes that control particular traits, meaning that there are different alleles in the population. Let's say, for example, that there's a gene regulating whether we tell the truth or not, right? Let's assume that this gene exists in two different forms, two different alleles, one that makes us tell the truth and another one that makes us lie, right? Both telling the truth and lying could be adaptive, but only or presumably most likely if these two alleles are maintained in the population at a certain equilibrium. So that's frequency-dependent selection, the idea that certain traits can be advantageous as long as they remain rare, or as long as there is a certain balance between the alleles controlling that trait and a different allele. The tool that we use to analyze these phenotypes, these aspects of behavior that involve, for example, decision-making, how we make decisions in different situations, is game theory. Game theory is a set of models derived from economics that essentially allow us to study individual decisions or individual strategies in relation to the decisions and strategies of other individuals that happen to be there in that situation.
What aspects of individual differences do you focus on in your work? Are you interested, for example, in personality, and do you use personality questionnaires in your research?
So I'm interested in all aspects of individual differences in psychological functioning and in behavior. So my background is in biology, and for many years I studied animal behavior, particularly the behavior of monkeys and apes. Although I've always been interested in individual differences, I discovered the concept of personality later in my career, and particularly when I switched to the study of human behavior, I found that understanding how personality works is crucial to understanding individual differences in the human mind and human behavior. So yes, now I do mostly human behavior research. I'm very interested in the idea of personality. In my lab, we do experimental studies of personality and other traits. And yes, I do use questionnaires such as the Big Five or the Hexaco questionnaire for assessing personality. I know that not all behavioral scientists who study personality are happy with this particular conceptualization and this particular way of studying personality. So they have some issues with the use of self-reported measures. The idea that you ask a person to describe their own personality through a questionnaire, and so you rely on what they tell you. So the problems with this is one, that people sometimes are not reliable about describing themselves. They don't even fully understand themselves. And second is that there might be some circularity in the sense that you define personality in a certain way depending on how people respond questionnaires, and then you use questionnaires again, for example, to study how personality affects certain behaviors. And so you essentially, you engage in some circular thinking because you use the same measures both to describe what you're interested in and then to test hypotheses concerning this variable. There are different ways of studying individual differences that do not involve self-report questionnaire-based measures. For example, there are researchers who are interested in temperament. So temperament is usually defined as a reactivity to stimuli, reactivity to the environment. It can be standard. It can be operationalized with physiological measures. So, for example, you can measure differences in temperament among young babies or children, and you can measure temperament in terms of how they react physiologically to stimulation. For example, you can measure cortisol in saliva, you can measure heart rate. And so in this case, there are more objective measures of temperament. There's other ways of studying and understanding individual differences that do not necessarily involve the construct of personality. For example, some people prefer to think that there are broad individual differences in appetite for risk, such that some individuals like risk, they don't have trouble taking risks. Others instead are very risk averse. There's also broad individual differences in sensitivity to reward and punishment. Some people are very sensitive to reward. They will work very hard to obtain rewards. Others are very sensitive to punishment. They will do anything to avoid punishment. And finally, there are individual differences in impulse control. So some people are able to effectively inhibit their impulses. For example, they're able to delay gratification. You know, of course, the famous marshmallow experiment with children, when children were asked, would you like to have one marshmallow today or maybe 2 or 3 marshmallows the next day. So children who are good at controlling their impulses are able to wait till the next day to get more marshmallows. So these are differences that are fairly stable over time, can be measured fairly easily. And some people think that there's more value in using these differences than in using personality constructs. But I think personality, with its own limitations, is a very interesting and valuable tool. I've become particularly interested in recent years in sort of more extreme versions, or more extreme expressions of human personalities that we sometimes call personality disorders, which in many cases, in my opinion, they're not even disorders. They're just essentially these personality traits are distributed normally. So most people have sort of the intermediate values of these personality traits, but others sort of like the tails of the distribution. And I'm interested in those individuals because they can tell us something about that personality trait as a whole. So by studying the extreme expression of that trait, so for example, if you're interested in empathy, there are people that are very empathic, other people that have almost no empathy. So by studying these extreme individuals who have little or no empathy, so for example, psychopaths or narcissists, I think we understand something about how empathy works in general. So I'm very interested in that.
Mm-hmm. So another thing you're interested in, are humans an aggressive or a peaceful species? And I mean, is this really the best way of framing the question? Does it make sense if we frame it this way? And I mean, if it's one or the other, how do we know that?
Yeah, it makes sense to ask the question and to frame it this way. There's obviously a lot of variation in aggressiveness, both at the individual level. So this brings us back to the issue of individual differences, but also at the species level. We know that some animal species are fairly peaceful. We rarely, if ever, see individuals of the species getting into fights, like sheep, cows, mountain gorillas. It's hard to see them fight with each other. And other species instead who are known for being more aggressive. For example, carnivores, lions, tigers, hyenas, chimpanzees, other species of primates, and human beings. I think asking whether humans are an aggressive or a peaceful species is fine, but the answer is neither. So we're neither an aggressive nor a peaceful species. We are a species with high potential for aggression, which means in some circumstances we could be aggressive, we could express this aggressiveness, but not necessarily. We are perfectly capable of living in peace side by side with thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people that we barely know. So our aggressiveness, if you want, is what evolutionary biologists call a conditional adaptation. So as a competitive strategy, there are situations in which you're competing with other individuals and you use aggression to compete. But it depends on the context. So in some contexts, in some situations, it makes sense to be aggressive, and in others it doesn't. What really changes from one context to another is the balance of the benefits and the costs of aggression. So if you see aggressiveness as a competitive strategy, as a way to get what you want that cannot be shared with other individuals, the benefits of being aggressive are basically obtaining what you want. So you obtain whatever you're competing about. There are costs, though, particularly for physical aggression. You could be injured, you could die, you could damage relationships, you could waste a lot of energy, and so on and so forth. So to understand why some individuals or some species are more aggressive than others, you need to look at this benefit to cost ratio. So if the benefits are greater than the cost, then you would expect individuals to behave aggressively. If the benefits are lower than the cost, you would expect individuals to use non-aggressive strategies. So these benefit to cost ratios vary a lot. They can be actively manipulated. For example, human societies try to curb human aggressive and violent behavior by keeping the costs of aggression high. So you get sanctioned. if you're violent. You go to jail, you pay fines, etc. So this makes sure that people are not tempted to behave aggressively just by the benefits of aggression. But despite all efforts to curb aggression, for example, to keep it costly, there are situations in which the benefit to cost ratio is so imbalanced that it's almost inevitable to see aggression. I've used this example before, but if you think about the situation in which European colonizers first encountered the indigenous populations of, let's say, Central South America or Africa or Australia, New Guinea, they wanted something. They wanted the indigenous people's land, their resources, their gold, their women. And obviously they came fully armed. They had armies well equipped. The indigenous populations were not well armed. So they resorted to violence and aggression because the benefits were very high, obtaining all the resources from the indigenous population, but the costs in that case were very low because there was such an imbalance in armaments that essentially, and also the normal psychological costs that are associated with being violent or aggressive towards another human being. In that case, people sometimes dehumanize others, so they view them as a sort of a lower kind of human being, or sometimes they think of them as animals. So that reduces the psychological costs. So in that situation, given the imbalance, it's normal. Obviously, that doesn't make it ethical. So whenever we analyze these things through cost-benefit analysis, it has nothing to do with morality or what we consider socially, ethically acceptable. It's a purely rational, economic type of analysis.
Mm-hmm. And talking about costs and benefits, what are the costs and benefits of knowledge and ignorance?
Yeah, that's a good question, which relates to the previous question, because just like we don't have a predisposition to be aggressive all the time, we don't also have a predisposition to appreciate or to seek knowledge and truth all the time. So appreciating and seeking knowledge and truth is not like liking sugar. All human beings essentially are designed the same way in the sense that we find sugar good. So we are attracted to sugar because it's an important component of our diet. We need it. It's not the same. The human mind does not relate to knowledge and truth the way the body relates to sugar. So in some situations, yes, knowledge is useful, important. It has an adaptive value. In others, not necessarily. What makes a difference, for example, is whether this knowledge that we acquire helps us survive or reproduce. So natural selection in the past, from the time humans, greatly enlarged their brain, and essentially humans moved into this cognitive niche where the way humans interacted with their environment was becoming increasingly based on cognitive processes, so your thoughts, your interpretation of others, and so on and so forth. So natural selection had essentially worked on the human mind in terms of being able to acquire knowledge that is useful for survival or reproduction. And knowledge can be very useful. Obviously, we use knowledge to predict and to some extent control our own behavior, as well as the behavior of others, and even the behavior of the physical environment. So, for example, all human beings have an interest in understanding weather patterns, predicting earthquakes. So knowledge of these phenomena allows us to predict and control. So knowledge in this case is power, right? But not all human behavior is driven by knowledge and guided by rational decisions that are made on the basis of this knowledge. Much of our behavior, particularly social behavior, on a day-to-day basis, is regulated, controlled, driven by motivations and emotions. So natural selection has equipped us with these physiological systems that involve brain circuits, neurotransmitters, hormones, and so on and so forth. such that for things like hunger, thirst, competitiveness, sexuality, we have these motivational systems that drive us to achieve certain goals. Or we have emotions, happiness, sadness. Knowledge can, in some situation, suppress these motivations and these emotions and interfere with our adaptive, everyday behavior. So, for example, knowledge of something unpleasant or damaging can make us depressed, can change our emotions in the direction of becoming sad and depressed. That will interfere with our lives sometimes. Or it can lower the motivation for certain healthy things like for eating, for seeking companionship, sexual interaction. So in some cases, it's better not to know. So there's a saying, ignorance is bliss. In some cases, it's better not to know too much or not to know certain things because that knowledge will interfere. So what Socrates said, know yourself, is not always true. In some cases, it's better not to know yourself or maybe to have a slightly biased, slightly optimistic view of yourself. That's functionally might be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. So, in terms of knowledge, but now applied to an entirely different realm, can art and literature be a source of knowledge about the human mind and human behavior, and in what ways?
Of course they can. I mean, generally speaking, any human artifact, anything made, produced by humans, can tell us something about the person, the people who made it. So whether it's a piece of art or some literary work, architecture, buildings, anything, the building of bridges, can be analyzed to make inferences about the individuals who built them. To give you an example, there's some new studies that in which computer programs are used to analyze large amounts of texts. And so what they do is that these programs focus on particular keywords, so how often they recur in the text or in what context they recur, or how sentences are structured. And then one can make inferences about the personality of the person who wrote that text. For example, if things are narrated using the active voice versus the passive voice, how many times people use the word I did this, I did that. In theory, you can make inferences about a person being narcissistic by the way they write, by the way they express themselves, by the vocabulary they use, the way they use language. So this can be done with, for example, social media posts. You can analyze how people write on social media, or you can analyze novels this way. So this is a way to get information about people's minds, their behavior, who they are, from what they do, from what they produce. But in another, maybe more interesting way, I think art and literature can tell us something about knowledge, can provide insights into knowledge of certain issues, including the human mind and human behavior, because in some cases, art and literature contain ideas. So essentially, the artists, the novelists, the poets write something, produce something to express or explore certain ideas, which may be their own or maybe somebody else's ideas. So, for example, I've become interested lately in a literary genre known as the novel of ideas. So these are particular kinds of novels that you could say they're intellectual, or they're essentially driven by philosophical, scientific, or other types of ideas. So in some cases, the author has an interest in developing some general framework for explaining a certain phenomenon or exploring some ideas. And that can be a first step to the production of knowledge. So as we know, the first step in the process of producing scientific knowledge is producing theories, right? You need to have a theory of a certain phenomenon to be able to study that phenomenon. And what scientists do is that first they they generate this theory, which is essentially a fiction, because a theory is the product of, your creativity, your imagination, with input from data and work that other people have done. But the first step is to create this essentially work of imagination, this work of fiction. Then from that, you extract hypotheses. From the hypothesis, you derive predictions, and then you test those predictions empirically. Well, I think there are some works of art, some works of literature, in which the authors really put together a set of ideas and they explore them in a way that is almost suggestive of a theory. So, for example, I became interested in early 20th century European literature because at that time psychological novels were popular. So authors, novelists, writers started writing very introspective novels in which they brought the reader inside the mind of the characters. And the goal of some of these novels was to explore and understand the human mind or human behavior. Some of these authors had read scientific theories about the human mind and human behavior, and so were inspired by those. So I read these novels sometimes as a scientist, and I could see how one could extract almost a scientific theory from this work and then express it in forms of hypotheses, and then one could test these hypotheses. So I believe that ideas are fundamental in the process of the production of knowledge, and ideas are not monopolized by scientists. Anybody can have ideas. And artists obviously have lots of ideas, and because many of them are interested in human behavior, they're very good observers, they're very highly sensitive people, they can have very good insights about human behavior and the human mind, and they can express ideas in their work. Unfortunately, scientists have not paid enough attention to ideas expressed by artists, but I think in theory this is possible.
Mm-hmm. So now this question is sort of, I think we can tackle it both as a scientific and a philosophical question. So is knowledge a unitary phenomenon, or are there different kinds of knowledge?
I believe in the unity of knowledge. I believe that there aren't different kinds of knowledge, but I believe that there are different ways of looking at a certain phenomenon that we want to explain, different perspectives and different ways of producing knowledge. But in the end, I think knowledge is just one and the same. So we see a lot of boundaries being created and maintained, for example, between different academic disciplines, which all aim to produce knowledge, but they do it in different ways. This is mostly done for practical purposes. It's helpful and convenient to set up boundaries between academic disciplines because that facilitates a sort of division of labor among the educators. It facilitates the acquisition of expertise, competence, and specialization. I mean, most of education, for example, at the college level these days involves some degree of specialization. But this should not be interpreted as suggestive that these boundaries are real, that different disciplines produce different kinds of qualitatively different knowledge, or that they're addressing qualitatively different aspects of the world. Just to give you an example. So I don't have any problem if people talk about mind and brain, because we usually use these terms to refer to different things. So when we think about the brain, we think about the biological organ, the structure. When we think about mind, we think about what the brain does, the function, all the amazing cognitive abilities that our brains are capable of. But we don't necessarily have a dualistic view of the human body or the human mind as consisting of both material and non-material entities. So similarly, when we say that if you want to understand humans, human nature, what it's like to be humans, there is an objective and a subjective dimension. So the objective reality of a human being is the way we look, our bodies, our physicality, our observable behavior. The subjective is sort of our unique perspective, our subjective interpretation. Both obviously are valid perspectives, but that's not the same as saying that these are two different aspects of the world, that essentially subjectivity belongs to a domain that is non-material, that is not regulated by the laws of matter. So when some colleagues in the humanities tell students, if you're interested in objective aspects of being human, you should study the sciences. If you're interested in the subjective experience of being a human, then you need to study the humanities. I think that's wrong and misleading. I think the sciences can handle both the subjective and the objective aspects of being a human, and so can the humanities. You can address both subjective and objective aspects of the human experience in the humanities. So this distinction is a little artificial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, even when it comes to the subjective or more objective aspects of human nature, I mean, many times they can inform each other, correct?
Absolutely, definitely.
Mm-hmm. And so this brings us to a concept that, if I'm not mistaken, was introduced by Edward O. Wilson in the early 90s or somewhere around there, which is consilience. So what is it and why is it so important?
So the way E.O. Wilson used this term in various articles and in a book that he published is to talk about the unity of knowledge, this idea that I've just illustrated, that there might be different ways of producing knowledge, but knowledge is essentially a unitary phenomenon. And so what Wilson did was a call for scholars of all backgrounds, of all academic disciplines, to join efforts and to communicate and collaborate with each other in this process of knowledge production. Unfortunately, ever since the middle of the 20th century, we've seen an increasing compartmentalization of academic disciplines, of areas of research, which, as I explained, is mostly done for practical purposes. But now professors sometimes justify these boundaries as if they were conceptually, theoretically valid. In my opinion, these calls for autonomy of some disciplines versus others are no more than territorial behavior. So people actively patrol and defend the boundaries of their area. I think this is a little counterproductive, and limiting, both in terms of research and in terms of education. So I think creating consilience means realizing that these boundaries are in many cases artificial, that by choosing one approach and excluding others as if they were incompatible, we're essentially limiting ourselves in our ability to understand the world in a comprehensive, systematic way. And also when we teach students that these boundaries are real, and then they need to make a choice about the side of the fence that they want to be on, I think we do a disservice to the students.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, still on that topic, and probably my last question, and since you're an interdisciplinary researcher and are interested in knowledge from many different areas and to combine them, I mean, what would you say is really interdisciplinary research? I mean, how can people do it without losing some rigor when it comes to, for example, doing science and combining it with knowledge from the humanities and or something like that?
Right. Very important and helpful question to ask. Before I answer, I want to say something more about why I think consilience is important. Mm-hmm. I think consilience is important because human beings and the world in which we live are intrinsically consilient. In other words, this compartmentalization of knowledge is something that comes from us. But I think this is not the way the human mind works, and it's not the way the world is organized. To give you an example of this, I think normally knowledge should flow freely from one domain to another. Let me give you an example. For example, think about the concept of wisdom, right? So we call a person wise if this person has knowledge and understanding across multiple domains. If somebody has expertise in one domain, is a specialist, we don't call that person wise. So the process, in general, people get wiser with age, with knowledge and experience. So if I can provide an analogy about why people and their knowledge become more consilient, it is this one maybe. Imagine that when we're young and we start our process of education, it's as if knowledge about the world, ourselves, exists in different pockets. They're separate from each other. It's as if like every pocket of knowledge is into a different room and the door is locked so that there's no communication between these rooms, and so we learn the content of each room separately. As we learn and acquire the knowledge from each room, we unlock the doors, and then we leave the doors open such that the knowledge flows from one room to the other more and more. So to me, a person becomes wise, so achieve wisdom, when essentially has explored many different rooms, has acquired all these different pockets of knowledge, and the knowledge now flows from one room to another. So I don't know if this analogy is useful at all, but essentially I think this is the way it works, and I think it works in most people. As they age, for example, they become wiser in that sense. So back to your question about interdisciplinary. Sometimes you see this word used interchangeably with the word multidisciplinary, but they're not the same. They're different things. So multidisciplinary, as in multidisciplinary research or a multidisciplinary university department, simply means that you have different disciplines standing side by side, so being close to each other, but not necessarily touching. So, for example, a multidisciplinary department is equivalent, perhaps, to a zoo in which there are animals of different species, each sitting in a different cage, and people can go and visit all these cages with different species. Interdisciplinary, instead, is essentially producing hybrids, is letting animals of two different species reproduce and create something new. So a truly interdisciplinary approach is a hybrid between two or more different disciplines, both conceptually and methodologically. So it's something different that has, for example, a new language for expression, a new way of thinking. So it's much harder than just keeping people together from different disciplines and even talking to each other. It's just really a new way of thinking and communicating. And I think this is important to be done both in research and in teaching. So in my own area, I'm interested in human behavior, the human mind. This, by definition, requires an interdisciplinary approach or perspective. And when I teach my students that if you become interested in a particular question, they should not exclude a priori the approach, the perspective, the findings provided by another discipline simply because it's not their discipline of choice. So they should keep their minds open. They should develop expertise, at least to understand the language with which other scholars communicate and have some knowledge of what they produce, of what they do with their work.
Mm-hmm. Very well. So, Dr. Maestripieri, just before we finish, would you like to mention where people can find you and your work on the internet?
Yes. So I have a web page on my department from which they can find a link to another web page that I manage myself that has some basic information about my professional work, my CV. They can Google me. Read my books on Amazon. My email address is also relatively easy to find. So if somebody wants to have a direct conversation with me, I'm always quite happy when people reach out to me. For example, if I wrote a book, which I did in the past a few times, it makes me very happy when a reader of my book reaches out to me via email and tells me, I really enjoyed reading your book. It really made a difference, or wants to ask me a question. So I'm perfectly happy to engage in direct communication about ideas or work or anything that I do. So it's okay.
Okay, very well. I will be leaving links to your work in the description box of the interview. And thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
You're welcome. The pleasure is mine.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, hit the subscription button, all of those things you already know. And please consider supporting the show either on PayPal or Patreon. All of the links will be in the description box of the interview, starting at $1 per month, so it would be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pererga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bulut, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy and Trader in NYC. My producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luis Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codreanu, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.